Today, we're jumping into the complex and, honestly, pretty dramatic story of the British in Burma. We're going to look at how a kingdom fell, how an empire took its place, and the incredible fight for freedom that defined a nation.
And let's kick things off with a question that, on the surface, just doesn't seem to make sense. How can a powerful kingdom, one with centuries of history and tradition, be completely wiped off the map in just 2 weeks? It sounds impossible, right? Well, that's the puzzle we're piecing together today.
So, to understand the end, we first have to understand the beginning. We need to rewind the clock and see what Burma was like before the British ever arrived. Because this was a thriving, independent nation with its own way of life. And at the very heart of this nation was the Kumbang dynasty. Now, we're not talking about some small, regional kingdom. These guys were a powerhouse. From the mid-1700s, they built the second largest empire in the history of Burma. They were the ones who really laid the groundwork for the modern state we know today.
So what did life actually feel like back then? Well, at the top you had a king with absolute power. But for everyone else, life was tied to the land. The economy was all about agriculture, and the massive Irrawaddy River was like the nation's main highway. Everything flowed along it. Culture and religion were totally intertwined. Buddhist monasteries weren't just for worship, they were the schools. Life was filled with festivals and really strong family connections. It was its own complete, self-sufficient world.
And then, everything changed. The British Empire showed up on the doorstep, and it set the stage for a clash of worlds that would end in a sudden, violent conquest. This takedown happened in 3 main phases.
See, this wasn't a single event. It was a 60-year process. The First War, back in 1824, was an absolute slog. It was brutal and incredibly costly for the British, but it got them a foothold. Then, in 1852, they came back for round 2, this time strategically grabbing all the valuable ports and coastal areas. And then came 1885, the final blow, the one that took just 2 weeks.
So why was it so fast? How did it all crumble in the blink of an eye? Well, it really came down to a staggering, almost unfair gap in technology. The Burmese soldiers were incredibly brave, but they were fighting with swords, spears, and old-school muskets. The British, on the other hand, brought the Industrial Revolution to the battlefield. We're talking steamships sailing right up the river, modern rifles and artillery that could hit you from miles away. It was a complete mismatch.
In the end, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was a calculated national humiliation. The last king, Thibaw, wasn't just removed from power, he and his family were paraded through the streets in a common ox cart, the kind a farmer would use, and shipped off to exile. This one single image, this act, was designed to show everyone that an entire era was over.
And just like that, with the king gone, Burma as an independent country ceased to exist. It was absorbed into the British Indian Empire, becoming just another province on the map. And everything about its society was about to be taken apart and put back together in a totally new way.
The new goal was simple: make money for Britain. So the economy was completely rewired. First, they went for the natural resources, especially the valuable teakwood. Then, they turned huge areas of farmland into rice paddies, not to feed Burma, but for export. This system often pushed local farmers into debt until they lost their land, forcing them to work as laborers on fields their families had owned for generations. All that wealth? It was siphoned right out of the country and sent back to Britain. This new economy created a brand new social ladder, and it was completely upside down. At the very top, you had a tiny group of British rulers and businessmen. In the middle, the British brought in people from India and other places to work as moneylenders and low-level administrators. And at the very bottom of the pyramid, in their own country, was the vast majority of the Burmese people.
Now, how do you control a whole country like that? Well, the British used a classic imperial tactic: divide and rule. They drew a line, basically. They governed the main Burmese population in the lowlands directly, but they managed the ethnic minority groups in the hills differently, often through their own local leaders. This created suspicion and kept people from uniting against them, a strategy that would leave some really deep scars long after the British were gone.
But you can't just extinguish a nation's identity like that. Over the decades of British rule, a powerful spirit of resistance began to grow. A new nationalist movement was born, and it was determined to win back the country's freedom.
This movement started from different seeds. At first, it was cultural groups like the Young Men's Buddhist Association, which was all about preserving Burmese traditions. But then it got more political, more radical, with groups like the Thakins. They defiantly started calling themselves Thakin, or Master, the very title the Burmese were supposed to use for the British. And eventually, this led to militant groups like the 30 Comrades, young men who realized they needed military training to physically force the British out.
And you can see this fight heating up over time.
In the 1920s, university students went on strike. In the 1930s, there was a huge rural uprising called the Saya San Rebellion. But the real game changer? World War II. The war absolutely rocked the British Empire, weakening its grip all over the world. For the nationalists in Burma, this was the opening they had been waiting for.
So, after decades of protest, of struggle, of war, the moment finally came. The British Empire, exhausted by a world war and facing an undeniable call for freedom from its colonies, knew its time was up.
January 4th, 1948. On that day, in the capital city of Rangoon, the British Union Jack was lowered for the very last time, and in its place, the flag of a new, independent Burma was raised. After more than 60 years of being a province, the nation was its own master once again.
So, independence was won, a nation was reborn. But the story doesn't just end there. The legacy of this colonial period is incredibly complicated. The economic damage, the social divisions that were created, those things didn't just vanish in 1948. And it leaves us with one final, big question to think about. What is the true price of a lost century?